Welcome to Tell This Story, the podcast that brings you the real honest conversations about perseverance, growth, and finding purpose after a life of service. I'm Doug White, a veteran, retired first responder, and author of Hiding in Plain Sight, the truth about trauma, service, and the way forward. This podcast is a platform where veterans, first responders, their families, and thought leaders share their experiences and insights. We move beyond origin stories and focus on the way forward, highlighting perseverance, post-traumatic growth, and the transitions that shape the next chapter of life. Together, we'll explore what it means to thrive, to lead, and to embrace new possibilities as we face life's challenges. We are honored to have a remarkable guest, Dr. Chris Frueh. Dr. Frueh is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Hawaii in Hilo. He has over 30 years of experience working with military veterans, special operators, defense contractors, and first responders. His pioneering research in clinical trials, epidemiology, and neuroscience has shaped our understanding of mental health and resilience in these communities. A leading authority on operator syndrome, Dr. Frueh has highlighted the complex interplay of health, psychological, and interpersonal challenges that special operators face. His work underscores the critical role of physiology and mental health and the need for comprehensive, multidisciplinary approaches to treatment. Dr. Frueh is dedicated to improving health, wellness, and performance through his involvement with organizations like the SEAL Future Foundation, Boulder Crest Foundation, and the All Secure Foundation. A prolific scholar, he has co-authored over 325 scientific publications, including a graduate-level textbook on adult psychopathology, and previously served as a professor at the Medical University of South Carolina and Baylor College of Medicine. His expertise has been featured in prestigious outlets such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Scientific American, and The Economist. He's also reached specialized audience through Stars and Stripes, the Special Operations Association of America, and lifestyle platforms like Men's Journal and National Review. This showcases his ability to connect with diverse audience from policymakers to the military and first responder communities. Dr. Frueh has testified before Congress and served as a contractor for the Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs, and the U.S. State Department, as well as the National Board of Medical Examiners. Well, Chris, welcome to Tell This Story. How are you doing today?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me. And I'll just say this early on. I've been reading your book and really appreciate it. It's well written, and I think it tells an important story in a very effective way. So I wish you all the best with getting that book out there to be read and exposed to other people.
Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. That's very high praise, and thank you. Your book as well, Operator Syndrome, which we'll talk about. Anybody who's seen my episodes knows that I have a problem with highlighting and tabbing pages. So I run out of stickies pretty quickly. So
I need to get some stickies for my reading.
Well, if you find it sticky worthy, I would love that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it afterwards. So if you would, just tell our audience a little bit about your background. I know I covered it quite a bit in the extensive intro because you've had an extensive career. What made you decide to get into psychology in the first place?
I went to college, undergraduate, thinking I would be a history major. In my first semester of college, I took a psychology course that I just loved, and then I just kept taking psychology courses from that point forward. And so I majored as an undergraduate in psychology. I didn't really think of myself as a mental health clinician. So my first effort right after graduating from undergraduate went to law school. And I started law school a few months after I finished college. And so I arrived in Bloomington at the Indiana University. And my first week of law school, I just hated every moment of it. Every moment, realized I was in the wrong place. So I started Monday, I dropped out on Friday and went home and licked my wounds. And it took me a year to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. And then the second year, I spent preparing to apply to graduate programs in psychology, and I was fortunate to get accepted into the University of South Florida. And I went there with the idea of wanting to work with veterans primarily. And my father was a veteran, my great-grandfather was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. And so I knew a little bit about how war, or I thought I knew a little bit about how war affected soldiers. when they came home. So that was what I wanted to do. And I was able to do my dissertation research with Vietnam veterans. And my last year of training and my first job were at VA Medical Center in Charleston, South Carolina.
Your experience there at the VA. I know you ended up working there about 15 years, correct?
Right. Yeah. I was a full time therapist for 7 years in a PTSD clinic. And then, kind of on a whim, on a lark, I had applied for an NIH grant that surprised me and everybody else, I think, by getting funded. And suddenly I had to divide and allocate my time a little differently. But I didn't stop being a clinician. So the first 7 years I was full-time therapist, and then the next 8 years I was about 25% of my time was still clinical, working with veterans. And then the rest of it was funded to do research.
What were your feelings with, I guess, the VA system and mental health care?
Oh man. Okay, there's a can of worms. So, first of all, I loved working at the VA. I loved my work. I loved my job. I liked the people that I worked with. Not all of them. Certainly, some of them really weren't that dedicated to what we were there employed to do. But for the most part, I was surrounded by really good clinicians, really good staff, and I liked the people I worked with for the most part. I liked my patients. I really enjoyed what I was able to do at the VA. I felt like the patients we served there were men and women who really were worthy and needed help in a variety of different ways. And I liked it. I liked everything about my work. I look forward to going to work in the morning and never had that sense of, oh, here comes Monday kind of thing. I never had the Sunday blues about work. Over time, however, um, I was frustrated with the VA as a system. Some of the policies, many of the things that were, kind of coming down from central office, the policies, the disability focus, which changed during the time I was at the VA in the 90s. And we can talk about that as because it was kind of a historical moment, those 15 years. And I'm quite sure the VA is very different now than it was while I was there. Most of our patients in the 90s were Vietnam era veterans, but we still had World War II and Korean veterans. So I was able to work with and treat several dozen veterans from those earlier wars. The Vietnam veterans were now in their mid to late 40s by the time I started there. And my father was a Vietnam veteran, not a combatant. He was a physician. So in a sense, I felt a real sense of duty and mission to those men and women who had served in the Vietnam War. I mean, I grew up in the shadow of the war with a lot of awareness of it, even as a child. So I couldn't have asked for a better start to my career. Now, what started to happen in the early 2000s was some of my research, some of my work pointed towards some of the policy problems that the VA had in terms of what you could see very clearly was there were veterans, or I should even say there were people using the VA to get disability who some of them weren't even veterans. We figured that out along the way. The VA at that time, and I don't know about today, but it didn't necessarily do a great job of deciphering who was a veteran and who was not. Of those who were clearly veterans, there was a significant portion who misrepresented the nature of their service, claiming to be in special operations when they were not, claiming to be prisoners of war, Vietnam era prisoners of war when they were not. The VA was very resistant to doing any kind of validity check on patients. At one point, I wrote a small piece with a gentleman named Bob McGrath, who at that time was president of the NAM POWS organization. He had been an aviator during the war and had spent, I think, 6 or 7 years in a prisoner of war camp in Hanoi. So he was one of the repatriated prisoners of war. And we did a little work together, and we extrapolated that it looked like the VA had identified potentially up to 10,000 individuals as Vietnam prisoners of war. And there weren't that many. I mean, Bob could name every single one of them alphabetically. He could just rattle off their names because that's one of the things they did was they memorized the name of every other prisoner of war in the camp. They called it the Hilton for younger generations who may not know the Hanoi Hilton. They memorized everybody's name. So if anybody got out, they would be able to report systematically the name of everybody who was there. And it was fewer than 800. So when we did a little searching around and we figured out that there were several VAs that had literally hundreds of POWs on their rolls, we wrote to the secretary of the VA with this concern. We didn't get a response. So we published a short article, a short letter in a psychiatric journal at the time. And then I had published some other studies showing problems with the way symptoms were being reported. There's a fair amount of gaming of the system. There's a significant number of people who apply for disability and pursue it, but maybe don't really have the traumatic events that they report or don't have the symptoms that they might be describing. And the VA did not like that, so I got leaned on pretty heavily by leadership, both at central office and some of the senior scientists in the VA, who essentially their argument to me was, these perspectives threaten our funding. I was never challenged on the facts or the merits. It was more about, well, this is embarrassing and it could hurt our funding. So stop with this work, stop publishing this work. We did a study where we actually did a Freedom of Information Act request for 100 consecutive patients who were putatively Vietnam veterans, combat veterans. And I worked with a guy named Jug Burkett at the time. Jug Burkett had, a few years prior to that, written a book titled Stolen Valor, which has now become a term. I mean, I think he kind of coined that term, and it later became legislation. He worked with the FBI and outing people all over the country who were kind of out in the public eye representing as combat veterans who either never served at all or never deployed or didn't do the things that they claimed that they had done. And in our very small study of 100 veterans, we found a very high number of people who grossly misrepresented, including, I think, 6 or 7 folks claiming to be from special operations who clearly were not. We had their DD-214, so we could match up what they told us with what their DD-214 said. And I'll make this a shorter story. Submitted the paper to a journal, and got a phone call a few days later from one of my mentors, who was the head of the National Center for PTSD branch in Boston. And he essentially said, you can't publish this. It'll hurt our funding. And Congress will ask questions, and we don't want that. And I said, well, but it's valid science. It's meaningful. He's like, well, it's a small study. And I said, exactly. It's a small sample. All the more reason to take it as a signal and to dig a little deeper. And
I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And he basically at that point said, well, if you persist and publish this somewhere, I will not be able to be your mentor, and your career will probably suffer as a result. He said some other things. I probably don't need to repeat all of them. But at that point, we resubmitted it to a different journal, and it was published by the British Journal of Psychiatry, which is one of the top psychiatry journals, and they're unaffected by American politics. So that's really kind of, I think, how it got to be published. And at that point, I had supporters in central office sending me notes saying, wow, this is good work. We're aware of this work. We're concerned too. We're looking at numbers, and we're looking at budgets, and we're looking at a lot of things that don't make sense. At the same time, I kind of became, I don't know what the right word is, but I was told I was no longer allowed to speak to the media without a VA publicist there. And so they assigned me, I think her name was Tanya, and Tanya followed me everywhere. She even would know who was in my office. One time a reporter came to the hospital to talk to me, and she showed up 5 minutes after that reporter walked in the door. That was kind of interesting. But The study itself got a lot of attention. Washington Post, The Economist, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and I had to get permission from her for every interview, and she had to sit in on every interview, and she had the power to strike a question or to strike my answer after the fact. So it was that was when I decided I had to leave the VA, and I left in 2006.
Yeah, I think that they would make that's a clear message that things are not going to be easy for you when somebody, it seems like, is actually watching you
Yeah,
and
yeah.
having you sitting there to censor you.
And this is a whole other. This isn't really why we came together to talk today, probably.
Mm-mm.
But for anybody that wants to dig into these issues more, there's a terrific book titled "Wounding Warriors."
I
Um,
heard you speak of it, and I had to read it myself. It's amazing.
yeah, Dan Gade, who is a former um, Iraq combat vet who lost his leg in Fallujah, and then former Dan Huang, who was a former Wall Street Journal reporter, wrote the book together. It's a terrific book, Wounding Warriors, how policy is making veterans sicker and poorer.
That is, I know you've covered this in several other podcast interviews you've done, and it's worth a listen to go in there if somebody is interested in that. Is very interesting. I'm astounded that people with their 214, I mean, the barrier to entry into the VA is at minimum a 214, I would think. And anybody who's navigated or tried to navigate, from my perspective and my experience, it's almost like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. So I'm amazed that people got away with that much. Well, I guess probably in the 90s and stuff, no interwebs and all that stuff. It's harder to track that stuff down. But at some point, you're going to be found out. My own experience with the VA, when I separated in 2007, late 2007, I went to the VA in '08, January, February. And I went here to James A. Haley here in Tampa, and I made my own appointments. I drove myself there. I parked in the way far out parking lot and
Oh yeah,
walked to the front. It's very different now, but then it was quite the walk because everything was under construction. But as I walked up to the main entrance of the hospital, there was a sign just off the walkway, and it said, "The price of freedom is evident here." And I had done 14 and a half years. I was not an operator. I did not deploy to combat. I'd like to think that I did my fair share of the task, but you've read the book and you're coming up to the spots where I don't believe that I did, and there's some regret there. But nonetheless, I walked in with my volume of medical records, and when I walked into the lobby after having seen that sign, there's older men that are in wheelchairs that have been in there since 43 or 44, and from wounds suffered in the Pacific or across the European
mm-hmm.
theater.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw 20-something year old kids clutching teddy bears being pushed by their mother or their caretaker. And I immediately knew that, again, I had made my own appointment, drove myself, walked across the parking lot. There was nothing here for me. And I met with the counselor and sat down. They reviewed my medical records, and they said, "Well, you have a job, with the sheriff's office, so you have medical insurance, yeah?" I said, "Well, yes." Closed my files and said, "There's nothing we can do for you." I said, "Cool, check, thanks." Walked across the parking lot, got in my car, and I left. And I never gave it any more thought.
You never went back.
No, I didn't. And
Can I interject with a question on that?
please.
What were they telling you? You had not passed whatever a means test they had, so you were not eligible for services?
It was a means test. They asked me what my annual income was and how
Okay.
long I'd
Okay.
been,
Yeah.
and I said, okay. And again, I knew nothing of the VA.
Yeah.
My out process, I mean, I've spent my last 10 and a half years roughly at SOCOM here at McDill.
Yeah.
And we had our own clinic. We had our own docs. I broke my ankle during PT and didn't go to see the doc until the next day when our chief said, "Why is your ankle purple and what did the doc say?"
Right.
And my answer was, "I didn't go see doc." So the next morning when the sun came up, that was what I was supposed to go do. So we didn't report stuff. And my ankle was broken with torn ligaments. And again, I'm walking around like everything's good to go. But anyway, I didn't argue it. Again, I had a job. I was gainfully employed, and I was on my own 2 feet. I didn't rate is how I
Yeah.
felt. So I left. And, over the years, I would meet with my old teammates. A lot would retire or come back after they retired, and we would have barbecues and get-togethers. And they would urge me and tell me, "Hey, get in the VA. You need to go in the VA. What's the VA doing for you?" My answer was always, "No, I didn't go. My ankle was broken when you guys deployed. I didn't get blown up. So and so did. I didn't get shot out of a helicopter. So and so did. I didn't have a hard parachute opening. So and so did. I don't rate." And yet they would persist over the years. And in 2019, when 12 years after I had separated, I had what I refer to in the book as my break. And luckily for me, and this will lead into operator syndrome and why it's important to me, I had a primary care physician who I'd been seeing for years. And I was in my early 30s. When I separated, I believe I was 7. I was 34 when I separated, 33 when I separated. And, I hadn't been sleeping for years. I was depressed seasonally, but all year. And, I would go and go see my doctor mostly for sports injuries. And he was a sports medicine doctor and also primary care, had his own practice, which is probably why I got lucky. But after my break, I went to go see him. And I said, "Look, this is what's really going on in my life. I sleep an hour and a half to 2 hours a day and have been for probably the last 6 months, the last 15 years. I haven't had a dream, all of the things, libido, focus, brain fog, all of this stuff." So he did a full panel of blood work. My total testosterone, I believe, was 168. I had sleep apnea. It was odd because I was a triathlete, avid runner, cyclist. In fact, one of the injuries I went to go see him for was a staph infection after a 250-mile bike ride. So I did stupid things. So there was no reason my testosterone should have been low. I mean, I was 230 pounds, but I could run and I could cycle, and I wasn't obese, but I had, obstructive sleep apnea. He ordered a sleep study and found that. He did basically all of the work and told me that I needed to go to the VA to speak with some of the mental health professionals there, because it was out of his realm of just family medicine. But he laid the groundwork for those things and got me to the VA. And that was
amazing.
really when I did anything proactive with them. And in January of 20, I went with them with my blood work and my sleep study and all of this stuff. And I had been diagnosed by a civilian psychologist with complex PTSD and a major depressive disorder and anxiety disorder, in addition to all those other things. And again, this didn't come because I decided, hey, I'm feeling a little off, let me go see the doctor. This was literally a gun in hand moment that led me to having these conversations and getting checked out finally. Although knowing for years that I was having issues, I just did not know what it was.
And if I may, you mentioned your military service, but you also what you were experiencing at that time wasn't entirely military. You also had been in law enforcement.
Yes. So I got off of active duty in 97 and came to work here for the sheriff's office here in Tampa in 98. And on 9/11, I was recalled to active duty for 37 months. Came back to the sheriff's office in late 04 and, would continue to go back and do my minimum mandatory and all that stuff. So I think one of the questions you may go to is what was the traumatic event? Was it from the military or from the sheriff's office? And I believe it was just not a single event. It was cumulative of all my experiences. And I knew that's where you would go because of your research. But yes, it was all cumulative, shame and guilt, having broken my ankle, and something not as sexy as playing zoo ball with the boys and not being able to deploy with my team, and the guilt and the shame there. And, you spoke earlier, one of your friends that you spoke to, the adult operator, talked about the ambition of shame. And I can relate to that completely. And as you continue in my book, I'm sure that'll scream pretty much on every page. And it's something that I didn't put together until just a couple of days ago. And when I was re-listening to a couple of your episodes, and, the drive to continue to prove that you deserved the company that you kept, to prove that you rated to be in the same room with the men and women that I was able to serve with. And so, yeah.
Well, you got to the VA in 2020.
Yes, I got to the VA in 2020, and they said, okay, we're going to enroll you in the medical and the health care system. I said, okay, I have health care, but whatever. So you guys are the
So, so,
experts.
so right there, I think I think part of the challenge that the VA has represented to veterans is it depends what year you go. It depends what decade you go. The rule, it depends which VA you go to. There's a lot of variation in terms of eligibility and sort of receptiveness. So one of the things that I've seen over the decades, is veterans that go and they have an early experience that's not welcoming. They go and they maybe never come back, or they come back many years later. And that's something that we saw in the 90s. A lot of the Vietnam veterans in the 90s had tried the VA in the 70s and essentially been told, go away, we don't want you, you're fine, or whatever. They had very bad experiences, so they didn't come back for 20 years. And the VA itself, their rules do change. So depending on what year, what decade, which VA you go to, what part of the country you're in, you could have very different experiences.
Well, Haley's a regional hospital, and we also have Bay Pines, which is also a regional hub here too. So
Mm-hmm.
when I went in 20, they were very receptive,
Mm-hmm.
which was a departure from what I had experienced in 07 or '08.
Yeah.
And I went in, the work was already done, and I figured, okay, you guys are the experts in PTSD. I just found out I have it, uh, sleep apnea, all this other stuff. So we did the interviews. They spoke to me, and I said, "Well, yeah, of course I have guilt, and I witnessed a couple of violent deaths while I was on active duty, but there's also now at the end of this, speaking in 2024 terms, there's also 25 years of having been a law enforcement officer, a very active law enforcement officer in a very
Mm-hmm.
busy place. 7 years of
Mm-hmm.
being on a bomb squad, having been a breacher, all of the things, and so they said, okay, well, you're getting in the healthcare system, so let's check you out for the PACT Act. Were you ever in these countries? So yes, I was in this country. Did they have burn pits? Like, yeah, it was like an ongoing barbecue there of trash
Mm-hmm.
and whatever else. So we went through that, and they said, well, what about TBI? And so I said, well, yeah, but in the military, yes, gunfire, claymore mines, because I was security forces. It's force protection, and yes, we fire machine guns and mortars and all of that stuff, but not on the level that you would see with an Army infantry troop, or like an
Mm-hmm.
0311 in the Marine Corps, and
Mm-hmm.
certainly not on an operational level that you see with some of the operators. So I dismissed all of that stuff. Have you been choked out? Well, yeah, I've been choked out, but was that because I was messing around with the guys on base and or I didn't place it anywhere, and I was dismissive of a lot of that stuff. And they said,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, you have mild TBI. I said, okay, well, I don't know what that means. So um, then I went to go to mental health, and they handed me the starter kit. Here's a bunch of pills that you might read that they don't go together, and you shouldn't use them together. But this one's for the depression. This one's for the anxiety. Here's here's your Xanax in case you need it. Here's something to help you go to sleep. By the way, you're going to have ED, so here's a pill for that. And we're going to treat you for low T, but we're only going to put it in the recommended range for the average man your age, not what you're optimal at. So yeah, I went through all of that process. I told the mental health folks that I don't want pills unless it's absolutely necessary. I did the CBT. I did the things that we're supposed to do, and every time I went back to go see them, it was more and more pills. I didn't want more and more pills. It just caused more and more problems.
Were you
Um,
taking the pills they gave you, or did you try them?
yes, I did, and I started off with the Wellbutrin, and it moved up quickly from there. Um, I found that as I changed medicines, Wellbutrin is the one that worked for me. Bupropion worked well for me.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the stuff, just the most vivid nightmares that I'd ever had. I mean, just awful to the point where I didn't want to go to sleep the next night. And I wasn't sleeping well as it was. Eventually, this summer, I was able to titrate off of everything. I'm on fish oil now. That's it, and a multi B vitamin.
Okay.
So I'm living life a lot better than I was having been under all the pills and everything else. I actually sat down with the psychotherapist at the VA, the last time she actually spoke to me. And I said, now that I'm retired, I'm not going to minimize the things that I've been talking to you about. Here's my life. Here's the truth. And after about 20 minutes, she was crying in shambles. I apologized for doing that to her. I walked out, and it's been a year and a half since I've heard back from them. So
I have heard that story, that experience, dozens of times.
it's sad. I mean, it really is, because some of the folks, I mean, I have a choice. I could have gone to my primary care, but I went there thinking that they were the experts. But
Yeah, yeah. I've
sad
heard
that,
that story so many times. Soldier goes and talks to a therapist who is emotionally emotionally just highly distraught by what the soldier experienced when they really talk about it.
well, and it puts us in a, well, for me, it put me in a very different position too, because
Yeah,
now I've made her feel this way. And of course,
right.
I'm the protector and the problem solver.
Now
So
you're
now I
trying to take care of her, right?
exactly, I shift gears
Yes.
and
Yep.
go back to minimizing and,
Yep.
trying to now help her
Yep.
through this. And
Right.
it wasn't productive for me.
Oh,
And, real funny story, I need to back up. When I went to the VA, I didn't have my medical records anymore. I had, just the basic stuff that I had hand copies of, but not nearly enough to explain everything. And I called Big Air Force and records and all that stuff, and nobody had any record of me other than my first MEPS trip in 1991 when I did the
good
delayed
grief.
enlistment. And I was like, well, I have these. I know I existed. I've got medals on the wall behind me. And I called back to the command, and it just so happened that our team doc, he's a retired chief master sergeant. He retired and went to work for the SOCOM Care Coalition, the POTF, Preservation of
Okay.
Force and Family. So he was there still at the command, and he said he's going to retire. He's still there. But I called him and said, hey, Doc, Big Air Force doesn't have my medical records. What do I do? And he says, I know they don't have them. I have them. So what do you mean you have them? He's like, yeah, bro, I've been waiting for you to call me for the last 12 years. And I said, wait a
Wow.
second, what? And he says, yeah. He says, I've carried these from every office that I've gone to. And he said, this is why we've been telling you for years to get in with the VA, because we knew you needed it. And we were just waiting for you to figure that out. And I have your records. Come pick them up. And sure
Wow.
enough, I went in there to go see Doc, walked into the command, and it was great being back there. Honestly, it was like a homecoming. But seeing Doc, he handed me this file, and he goes, here's everything. And I didn't believe him at first. And he goes, yeah, no, you said you were allergic to wool in 1991 at MEPS. And here's your final out process, ball jiggle in November of '07. I was like, oh my God, you have it all. I mean, everything, every sneeze, every broken bone, all of it was all there. He'd been holding them for me for all that time. So that's kind of a funny part of the story. Everything else really sucked about it, but that was the funny part.
Hmm.
So yeah,
That's amazing.
Doc took care of me.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So the VA has done better. Um, I'm not upset with them. I mean, they're doing the best they can. I think I would like to assume positive intent, but I don't understand why when you walk in there, the first thing they want to do is hand you pills. That's what I don't understand.
Well, that is the way the VA works. Sadly, that's also the way much of Western medicine works in general. And pills are, PTSD as a diagnosis has become their easy button because then that tells them what to do for you, which is to give you that, I like the phrase, starter kit of medications, which often starts with a few and then more get added as time goes by. And that over medication, I think, is in part related to the fact that they're missing the boat on, we, meaning Western medicine, is missing the boat on so many parts of the problem here. SSRIs are not going to help your testosterone. They're not going to fix your traumatic brain injury. They're not going to repair the pain in your knees and your elbows and your shoulders. Unfortunately, I think what we do too often, and the VA is a big part of this, but they're not the only part where this happens, is we make a very quick diagnosis, assumption. You were in the military, you did you saw some horrible things, you were part of some tough moments, and therefore you must have this diagnosis of PTSD. I mean, it's just an assumption. And that's the mindset of the mental health field, of my colleagues throughout the world in mental health. We make these assumptions and we're locked in on what that treatment then needs to be. Here's your therapist who may or may not have any competence to understand what you were experiencing. And then here's your bucket of medications. And at that point, they kind of want you to go away, take your medications and see your therapist once a month or every other month or whatever they allow for. There isn't really an expectation that you're going to get well, unfortunately.
No, it's amazing you say that because I was actually as dark, if not darker, mood wise and thought wise when I was on the medications than before the medications.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons I came off of them because there just became a point where I got so dark that I wasn't feeling anything,
Mm-hmm.
and it got scary for me.
Yeah.
Departing from that, but kind of sticking in the PTSD realm, post-traumatic stress injuries. I don't like to call them disorders because I think it stigmatizes people. It's a disorder. There must be something wrong with me. But can I get the Chris Free definition of PTS, not the DSM-5, but how do you see it?
How do the PTS diagnosis? I see it. Well, so we could get into a whole conversation about the history of the diagnosis, going back to the Civil War when it was called soldiers' hearts, and then later World War One shell shock. It was added as a psychiatric diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) in 1980, and that was the third edition of the DSM. So it's even to this point, it's still, I mean, that's 45 years ago. So it's still something of a relatively new diagnosis. When I showed up at the VA in 1991 for my last year of training, and my research was on PTSD, it was still a very new diagnosis. It was it was a decade after it had been added. And we're now on the DSM-5, so we're two editions of this book later. And in DSM-4 and DSM-5, the definition of PTSD was revised each time. What we used to think of PTSD in the 80s and 90s was that it was an anxiety disorder. It was categorized as an anxiety disorder. It was in the anxiety disorder section of the DSM. We pulled it out, and I say we, meaning the field, pulled it out of the anxiety disorders in 2013. We pulled it out and we gave it its own category, and we created it into something very new and very different at that point, conceptually. And I guess there's another piece that's important to understand about PTSD. It was and is really the only diagnosis in the entire DSM, all of the psychiatric diagnoses. It's the only one that has an identified cause. For all the other psychiatric illnesses, the DSM is completely agnostic on causes. So depression, it doesn't specify a cause of depression. What we attempted to do with PTSD was to identify a quote cause, which is often referred to as the index trauma, as if there's just one trauma that you've experienced. So my definition of PTSD is that it's really about fear reactivity. The trauma, and then later reminders or cues of trauma, have the effect of increasing physiological arousal. So it's that fear reactivity. You hear a noise or you smell a smell that reminds you of something you experienced, and your heart starts racing. Your breath you start to hyperventilate, you start to sweat, that kind of physiological arousal. And then associated with that is avoidance. So for somebody who has strong physiological reactivity, it's natural then to avoid those things that might cue or trigger. That triggers a more recent word. We used to call it cueing, CUE. And so for me, I still think of PTSD or PTSI as a disorder of cued reactivity and avoidance of feared cues. And it often overlaps with depression and just general anxiety, sleep disturbance, and nightmares, or other ways of kind of having intense memories that affect you. What I have seen is several things. One is if the folks that I work with don't really have the fear reactivity avoidance piece, they'll still go shoot at the range. They'll still do the work. They'll still jump out of perfectly good airplanes without any real trouble. Operators and law enforcement, it's not to say they're not affected. I think what we see is that arousal of that baseline physiological arousal definitely goes up, which should be the target of treatments. Unfortunately, most treatments don't target that. They don't address that. They don't deal with that. They kind of pretend like that's not really there. So the second problem with PTSD is pretty much anybody now who has either depression or general anxiety, if they complete a questionnaire for PTSD, they're almost certainly going to look like they have PTSD.
Hmm.
Because we've added so many other symptoms to the diagnosis now.
Well, that seems like it's gotten quite muddied.
We've watered the diagnosis down, and we've watered down what is a traumatic experience. Now almost
Yeah.
anything counts.
Yeah, a bad day. Like in one of the interviews, you said, the college experience, most kids see that as traumatic, and that may
It's
be a
often
bad day
referred to.
or
Yeah,
stressful. But
yeah,
I've seen trauma. That's not trauma.
yeah,
That's a busy day at school.
yeah.
So,
Exactly,
um,
exactly.
yeah, I think we've done that a
And
lot with words.
to your point there, Doug, I think you're right. We also at the societal level we've kind of lost perspective on what stress is. Stress and adversity have always been part of the human experience,
Hmm.
and there's no way to truly eliminate them, but we've tried to. So now we have a younger generation that thinks if they're uncomfortable, that's a bad thing. Um,
No, and
and
stress. I mean, that moves you to action.
yes,
I've got a
yeah,
deadline for this paper. I've got to
yeah,
prepare with an interview with Chris Free. I mean,
right,
these things drive you to be better and to
right,
perform and
right,
to either
right.
be optimal or to fail. You said something a moment ago about the baseline over the
Mm-hmm,
years, the cumulative stressors, or as you call it, the allostatic load. I was listening to a podcast you were on, and they were speaking about homeostasis and allostasis. And this was some time ago, but I was writing down notes feverishly as y'all were going through the conversation, and it's my understanding from that conversation that homeostasis is a return to normal. Well, in
mm-hmm,
allostasis, you said that it was the allostatic load is cumulative. So
mm-hmm.
with that, and my base understanding of the conversation was that with allostasis, you continue to move that marker to a new baseline each time. You never in the world of operators, in the world of first responders, there's very little time, if any time, to return to a state of homeostasis. There's always more and more
Therein,
and more.
right. Therein
Um,
lies the problem. A lot
and,
of the
and I
problem.
was going to ask you that. I mean, yes, a new baseline becomes a thing. It's like strength training,
Mm-hmm.
as in your words, you habituate. It's just something you become used to. But
Mm-hmm.
is there a point where you are physically, physiologically, emotionally that you just is there a break? And obviously I know the answer for me. I know where mine was, but
Yeah.
is that what we run into if we don't give time?
Well, I don't want to use the word break or broken, but yeah, absolutely. So as you go through a career in law enforcement, firefighting, combat, war, special operations, infantry, soldiers, over time, everything accumulates. So the repetitive stress injuries in your joints. If you keep running, keep lifting heavily, as you get into your 30s, 40s, 50s, you're accumulating injuries and damage. And it's that same that's your musculoskeletal system, but every other system in the body is affected in a similar kind of way over time as that allostatic load just builds and there's never a release valve or a release opportunity. Brain injuries, we saw this with football players and boxers and other professional and semi-professional athletes. A career of taking blows to the head, it may not be that first one, it may not be the fifth one, but over time, if you keep sustaining those impact forces to the head, you're accumulating concussions and your brain is getting more and more and more injured. So part of what happens, I think, with I'll just say operators over time is they don't take time off, so they don't heal. There isn't the healing opportunities, and there's just more and more accumulation of the allostatic load, which is a hypothetical concept to describe the physiological burden on all of the systems in the body. So the nervous system, the endocrine system, the musculoskeletal system, the respiratory system, cardiovascular, metabolic systems, all of these systems get affected, and they get worse over time.
I love that. So that moving into operator syndrome, what is operator syndrome?
Yeah. Well, several different places we could start. Let me start with this. So, just as we've just talked about, one of the assumptions is that a career in military special operations or many first responder roles involves an ongoing allostatic, high level of massive allostatic load. And so it's inevitable that this massive dose of allostatic load, as it accumulates, is going to have a profound impact on all of the body's physiological systems. So operator syndrome is a framework to help understand the constellation of the interrelated injuries and impairments that are going to develop, that do develop. And so, again, I think an important word here is framework. I like that you've used framework. It's not a medical diagnosis, it's a framework. And we can use the framework in two different ways, but they're obviously connected. One way is for someone like you, Doug, who's later in a career, and we're trying to understand and treat the injuries that have accumulated over the years. So it's about treating a constellation of severe injuries and impairments now. But if we use this framework, if we applied it to, say, a 20-year-old who's just signing their first contract, or just starting a career in law enforcement or the military, we can think of it as a framework to help better maintain their health, better maintain their functioning across all the important domains of functioning. So it's both a framework to understand treatment downstream, but also prevention and mitigation of injuries earlier and throughout a career.
I love that you made the distinction between old guy versus new guy. And one of the questions I wanted to ask later on is, and I will ask later on, is what we can do to use this framework. I mean, is it annual physicals through your organization where they keep track of those things? I think that's, we do all those things when we come into the job, but there's no out process like there is in the military. So we know your baseline when you're 22, but go away. Here's your cake and your retired badge, and now piss off. Yeah. And that's a feeling that I've read in several books, and it was obviously my feeling too, as you'll see in the book. But I want to come back to that. Okay. Mm-hmm. But with operator syndrome, what falls in the framework? What are some of the hallmarks that we should be looking for?
Yeah. Well, I can go through the domains really quickly. So let's start with traumatic brain injury, a TBI, which is pretty much inevitable in a career in special operations. And I think we know a little bit about impact forces and concussions. We're learning much more about breaching, blast exposures, what modern warfare and much of what law enforcement and firefighters deal with in terms of anything that explodes sends out a shock wave, an overpressure wave that's going to have a shearing effect. It goes through our soft tissue, and it causes a different type of injury to the brain than a concussion does. And over time, we're now learning that the accumulation of blast exposures, much like an accumulation of concussions, that it causes worse and worse damage, but it's a different type of damage. So the damage, the injuries, the traumatic brain injuries that soldiers and responders experience is complicated because it's often both blast exposures and impact forces and things like oxygen deprivation, being choked out, diving things. And then you add on that all the whiplash experiences of tactical driving, of rucking, of jumping and rappelling out of airplanes and helicopters. You add to that the toxic exposures that are inherent in many, many environments. You add to that the sleep deprivation and the alcohol use, the heavy alcohol use that's common in these lines of work. So there's a whole lot of vectors that are just hammering the brain year after year after year. So I always start with traumatic brain injury. And just to say a little bit more about that, it's hard for us to really diagnose traumatic brain injury. What we know about chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the damage caused, the long-term damage caused by blast exposures, which has been labeled interface astroglial scarring. To really understand both of those, we can't do it while you're alive.
That's amazing.
It's post-mortem studies. So what we can do is we can talk to you about headaches. We can talk to you and assess your cognitive functioning, cognitive impairments. We can look at your balance and disequilibrium. That's another common outcome of TBI is impaired balance, vertigo. Sometimes guys are very nauseous as well when they're dizzy and unsteady on their feet. We can do MRI or PET scans, but those really aren't as sensitive as people might think. They aren't really great diagnostic instruments for most people with a potential TBI. So I'm putting a lot on TBI here, and so I talk about that first. But let me go through some of the other things which are influenced by TBI. So that's partly why I say these are all interconnected. So sleep disturbance of insomnia, sleep apnea, you mentioned. Just the overall circadian disruption of night work, of traveling across time zones. And if you're not sleeping well, your brain isn't recovering. And if your brain is injured, that contributes to insomnia. So it's a vicious cycle right there. Then we add hormonal dysregulation. Low testosterone is very common. And it can appear as early as, the early 30s. Sometimes it's low coming off of deployments or coming out of very intense training or deployment experiences. It can be low for a while and then it can come back up. But as people cycle through that year after year after year, it gradually can go lower and lower and not come back up to where we want it to be. We have all the psychological things, the depression. I would put anger up there. Depression and anger are two of the very common features. And anger, I associate anger a lot with anxiety and that physiological arousal. If you're already at an 8 or a 9 of physiological arousal, if that's your baseline,
going to 10 is nothing.
Going to 10 is really pretty quick and easy.
Yeah,
and
I can relate.
So if we can get that baseline lowered down to a 3 or a 4, like with a stellate ganglion block treatment, that actually usually has a huge impact on reducing the irritability and the anger and helping guys and gals sleep better. We see a lot of substance abuse, fire stations, law enforcement, military units often have a culture of heavy drinking. So that's not unusual. We see impairments to many of the perceptual systems. I've mentioned balance, but also vision. It can be impaired. Hearing, obviously, when you're around loud noises, that can cause both ringing in the ears, but also hearing loss. I think an underappreciated issue is the chronic pain.
It's just the cost of doing business.
It's the cost of doing
baseline.
It. Right. And guys don't even talk about it. Sometimes I'll ask somebody like, how much pain are you? Oh, no, I'm fine. No, really, how much pain are you in? How do your ankles feel? How does your back feel? Well, yeah, they hurt, but that's just normal.
Yeah. 5 out of 10 is just operating pace. That's it.
Yeah. And guys are like you, they're breaking an ankle and they're not taking a knee. They try to keep going. And on and on and on. And then you add the headaches and the migraines that a lot of guys have. So that baseline level of daily pain can be pretty enormous. And of course, if you're hurting, whether you admit it or not, that's going to affect your sleep. It's going to affect your mood. It's going to affect your sociability with other people. And we ignore it too often. And there's things we can do for it that don't involve opiates. We can treat chronic pain in a variety of different ways. One of the things that I talk about with guys a lot when I'm coaching is, hey, if you're no longer active duty, what mission are you training for? Because we always train for the mission, right? Well, if you're no longer active, you're training for a very different mission. You're not training to carry 120 pounds on your back and run 20 miles with that. You're
But what if there's a
training.
guy in the gym that is doing that and you got to show him what's what? That's a real
Yeah,
thing that
well,
could happen.
I get it. You want to stay lethal. You don't want to not, you don't want to get, you don't want to not look dangerous. There are alternative ways to train. And so what I encourage guys to use is variable resistance bands, the big, heavy, thick bands that are like large circular rubber bands that work with a bar and a plate that you thread them under. You can stay you can stay jacked. You can get jacked with those with a band system like that. What you're not doing with those systems is you're not putting the same type of strain and stress on your joints. So bands work with your strength curve instead of against it, which free weights and body weight exercises do. I switched over to all band workouts about 4 years ago. So I'm in my late 50s at the time. And, I'm not that I was a tactical athlete ever or anything like that, but a lot of pain in my joints. And within about 3 months, all that pain disappeared. It just dissipated gradually. I used to do this whole complex thing for years of floor exercises for my back, stretches, crunches, planks. I carried a special pillow with me on airplanes when I traveled, a lumbar pillow, all this stuff. I don't do any of that anymore. And I don't have any pain. My back just like it got better because I stopped injuring it doing those kinds of workouts. Bed exercises. And to be clear, I'm not talking about the little hollow tubes that have handles at the end of them.
Oh,
I
the
mean,
thick rubber band. Yeah, I've
yeah,
seen those. Those are
yeah,
impressive.
yeah. And you can go heavy on them. There's bands out there that will go up to 600 pounds of resistance on them. Um,
Well, that's what else can we do? I'm sure diet and regular exercise and of course
so
sleep.
absolutely. Yeah. So absolutely. Diet, exercise, regular sleep, anything and everything we can put a focus on in our sleep, and then eating and living taking a healthier approach to our lifestyles. Let's come back to that because I haven't
Okay.
even gotten all the way through
Yes.
the operator syndrome. So we were just talking about chronic pain, cognitive impairments, so concentration problems, short-term memory problems, especially difficulty staying organized, difficulty learning new material. A lot of guys get out of the service and they're trying to learn a new career. They're going back to school. They're trying to figure out how to fit into a different type of culture and society. Well, guess what? All of that is much harder with the TBI. Learning new things is hard with the TBI. So that's a real thing. And another issue is one of the things that I hear a lot is family members, spouses in particular, get frustrated when their partner doesn't remember things, doesn't do the chores, doesn't bring the right groceries home, doesn't show up for the appointments. And that can often be misread as being, well, he's a jerk or he doesn't care or he's not really trying. But those are often, I'm not saying that there isn't some of that stuff, but there is a lot of that is caused by TB, traumatic brain injuries. And so then we have all the physiological systems. Now those injuries and impairments start to roll out and affect all the social systems that we have around us. So marital challenges are massive. Issues with children, intimacy is difficult. We can talk about sexual intimacy for sure, and part of that is when testosterone is affected, but also emotional intimacy. A very common result of the kind of roles we're talking about is when you spend every day of your work either seeing awful things that have happened to people or that people have done, or at least at the very least, those are potentially there every single day. It raises your threshold for stress and trauma. And so what we often see is spouses of an operator or a law enforcement officer will say, you've become insensitive. You're not empathic anymore. Other people can perceive you as being cold, not caring, just not as sensitive. And that's something that I think is almost universal that I hear. Transitions are another challenge. Transition points, which for a soldier, that could be coming home from a deployment. We see the TVs and movies where where the soldiers, the plane lands or the whatever, and the family meets them on the flight line, and there's this great big happy reunion. Well, and that those happy reunion moments are probably there often, but it's hard coming home from a deployment. It's hard for the family. It's hard for the soldier, and it's not just hey, everything's wonderful again now that we're reunited. It's much more tricky than most people realize. Then you have the transition at the end of a career. Now our soldier has to find a new way of living, a new job, has to learn how to fit into a different society, because civilian society is very different from military society. It's a different culture. Much of the language is the same, but not all of it. I've talked with recent newly minted veterans who have raised issues like, I don't even know how to dress for work. In the military, they told you how to dress. They gave you the clothing.
What is business casual?
Yeah, what the heck is business casual? And of course, even business casual today maybe isn't the same as it was 20 years ago. For responders, I think it's even, it's different and maybe even more challenging for a first responder coming home at the end of every shift.
Mm-hmm.
You're not coming home at the end of 6 months away in a foreign land, and your transition is not this big thing that happens at the end of 20 years. I mean, yeah, that comes too at some point. But as you know, putting on a uniform, doing a shift, whether that's an 8-hour, 12-hour, 48-hour shift, as some firefighters might do, and then the things you see and do during the course of that shift, and then you come home, and you're pouring Cheerios for your children and scooping cat litter and trying to have a conversation with your spouse about whatever is going on in the house, and you're trying not to bring all that allostatic load, I'll just call it that, all that existential allostatic load home with you. That's a challenge, and I don't have any great answers for how to make that easier.
That's the $1 million question. How do you offload in 5 to 10 minutes drive home?
Right. How do you do that? And I mean, there are things. Maybe it's a cold plunge, maybe it's a hot sauna, maybe it's an hour of meditation, or just coming home and sitting in your favorite chair and having nobody talk to you for an hour, whatever. But it's really challenging. And then the other piece of it is, and this is something that the soldiers always talk about with me, is they'll say, well, we had it easy because we're fighting in Iraq, we're in Afghanistan, we're on the enemy's home territory. We're taking the fight far away to them. Whereas responders, it's their home territory. It's your hometown. It's your own neighborhood. It's your community.
Yeah, there's no respite.
There's no respite.
Mm-hmm.
So you go to the grocery store. Who do you see there? What do you see happening there? There's no time for you just to kind of feel like you can kind of relax and let things be. You're out with your family. How are you not going to be vigilant, hyper vigilant? How are you not going to be looking around to see who is around? And you know things, where the hot spots are. We were talking before we started the podcast about some of the old neighborhoods we used to know in Tampa a few decades ago. Well, this neighborhood, that neighborhood, this block, that block, where to go and where not to go and where things are happening. So yeah, that's a whole other level. I don't have great wisdom on that. We mentioned toxic exposures. And then the last thing I'll say is part of I think a very important part of operator syndrome or responder syndrome are the existential concerns. And they're many and they're complicated. And it's not that every soldier has all of the existential concerns, but most have some of them. And we can go through those as much as you like, if you like.
Yeah, let's hit a couple of those.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we talk about, the big one, forever we've talked about guilt and shame. And we acknowledge and we know that those are powerful things that affect soldiers and responders. And sometimes it's the things that we did, and sometimes it's the things that we didn't do. Mm-hmm. The sins of omission, the sins of commission. And every guy I know has at least a handful of moments in their career where they went left and maybe they could have gone right. They went left, somebody died, If they'd gone right, what would have happened? Or they didn't do this, or maybe they didn't do anything at all, but somebody died in their place. Guys that I know, guys that were supposed to be on this helicopter got pulled off at the last moment. Whoever was in their seat, the helicopter went down, and that person didn't survive, or maybe got injured badly. I wear a casualty bracelet of Michael Mansour. Um, Mansour was Mr. Mansour died in Iraq in 2006. He was a SEAL, and he was up on a roof with two of his brothers, and a grenade came up, and he sacrificed his life to save his two brothers. And I didn't know Mansour, but I'm very close to one of those other guys who survived because of Mansour. So I kind of honor his experience in that moment. I wear this casualty bracelet, but that was an incredibly challenging pain for him to live with for many years. His brother died for him,
Mm-hmm.
and he lived because of his brother. How do you reconcile that?
I don't know how to answer that question, or do you ever? I think anybody
Well,
listening to this podcast knows of Michael Mansour, the rooftop, and the people you're speaking of. That's an incredible story in and of itself. The survival story, the sacrifice story, the service story. It's every bit of it's
yeah.
incredible.
And Mike Sorelli is the friend I'm referring to.
Yes, sir. You'll see him in my book as well.
Okay.
I am a huge fan of Mike Sorelli.
Okay.
He was one of the drive-by mentors on my journey. So it's a pretty incredible
Okay.
guy.
Well, he's on the cover of my book.
I know.
And I'll give Mike credit. How do you recover from something like that? And I don't know all of the details of how he did it, but a huge part of it was recognizing and accepting that Michael Mansour died for him because he loved him and wanted him to have a life. And for Mike to waste that opportunity feeling bad about things is not what Mansour would have wanted for him. And so I think Mike has taken that, and he's pretty much. He lives a life of service to others, and I think that's one way in which to surmount and to manage and to, I don't want to say overcome, but manage is probably a better word. Some of those feelings of guilt and loss. There are maybe a few other ones that are worth mentioning. I think killing is a very unusual experience for humans. Most of us never take a life, another human life. How do we can't relate to that, most of us. But for a soldier, and for law enforcement and for others, there are times where killing is part of the job. It's part of what has to be done to accomplish the job or the mission. It's part of what might have to be done to survive. And so we can talk about the horror of killing, and that's a very real thing for many. Not all, but many. The flip side of that, for many guys who have done quite a bit of killing in war, there's a thrill, there's an exhilaration to killing another soldier and surviving that encounter. And we don't talk about that. Soldiers don't talk about that. But it's not uncommon. I'm not saying it's universal, but it's not uncommon for operators to, when it comes up, when they're asked in the right moment, to acknowledge that they liked it, they miss it. It was a special kind of thrill. And at the same time, they can't talk about it, so they don't talk about it. So it's a secret that they live with, that they liked it. And they feel guilty about that. So very complex thing. There's the horror of killing, there's the thrill of killing, and there's the guilt of having that thrill. It's a complex thing. We often assume the first piece of that, the horror of killing. Mm-hmm. We frequently don't attend to the rest of it.
I can agree with that. It's read the book. So I wanted to go back to every bit of this, the framework. My biggest question here, and I think we hit on this prior to us starting to record, I am a lay person. I am not an academic. I'm not a clinician, MD, PhD, none of that. But looking at this, and I don't know if I'm biased because I can touch on a lot of these things and through lived experience, but it seems to me that this framework makes absolute sense. And attacking the cure and preventing these things, or at least understanding when they do come up, it seems to me that they have to be handled individually, but also as a holistic approach. You need to attack, or you need to at least identify as many of these as you can and treat each of them, because it seems to me that with treating one and not the other just keeps you trapped
Yes.
in a doom loop. Again, you said if you're
Yes.
not sleeping, your body's not repairing. If your
Right.
body's not repairing, your brain's not repairing, your endocrine system goes to trash, depression, cognitive decline. Every one of these things just feeds one another.
It's a humongous, great big, gigantic, vicious cycle.
Uh, I know it, having been chewed up by it for years and
Yeah.
years without even knowing what it was. And again, I'm so grateful for your work in this to find this framework and to put it out like this to finally give me an answer and a place to start. Why are people so resistant? And not people, but I'm sure that anybody who's lived this or understands this or has read the book can identify parts of themselves in here. But why is the medical community and the psychology community, why are they resistant to grab onto this and say, "My God, here it is," or at least, "Hey, this could be an answer. Let's test
Mm.
it out for a little bit. Let's
Yeah.
let's see, try it on, see if it fits."
Well, let me understand. Let me see if I can understand your question a
Mhm.
little bit better than I do. The Are you wondering why modern Western medicine has not sort of gravitated to using this framework?
It's a two part. That one, yes, and also, and I wasn't specific enough, but yes. Why isn't modern Western medicine grabbing onto this? And two, when I go to the VA, how come I speak to a primary care that wants to see how my cholesterol is, but then I've got to go see an endocrinologist, then I've got to go to mental health, and none of those people are talking to each other, and they have full access to everything.
Right. Right.
Why? Why is this thing? You
Yeah.
have the fix. Why is everything else around it broken? I guess is really the question.
Right. Right. Well, oh man, I mean, here's a long conversation. How do we fix American healthcare? How do we fix Western medical
let's
healthcare?
let's bring it in a little bit. We
Yeah.
can go everywhere there.
But there are some, I think there are some fundamental points here that are really part of the problem and are, across the board realities for all of us trying to get our health care. And so one is everybody is specialized now. Medicine is divided into specialties, and you've got your endocrinologist and their office is down the hall here, and you've got the mental health folks and they're down that way and they're in that wing, and your sleep doc is maybe over here in a different building on the other side of town, etc. And it's all fractured, it's all fragmented. So there isn't a holistic approach. Primary care docs, in theory, are the quarterbacks, they're the coordinators of everything. The problem is they don't have time. They're not given the time. It's not their fault. The systems now have said you have 6 minutes per patient on average. So that means you got to see 10 patients every hour. And if you only see 9 patients an hour for the first 6 hours of the day, and you get to the last 2 hours of the day, wow, now you're way behind, and you're going to be working. You got to really spend more time. So we've got a system that, in a lot of ways, just is not working very well. It's not designed to work very well the way it's evolved to be designed, at least. So that's a challenge for all of us. Another challenge is there is always a lag time as we, as clinical scientists, learn something, study it, publish it. There's a lag time where frontline clinicians learn about it and pick it up and become comfortable incorporating it into their care. So, for example, the operator syndrome paper, we published it in 2020. Let's say it's now 4.5 years later. I wouldn't expect any kind of miraculously, paradigm shift in healthcare that quickly. That isn't anything that we can expect or hope for. Now, I would say when we talk about mental health care, I think an easy question to ask with some righteous anger is, why is modern mental health care only really relying 98% of the time relying on therapy and psychiatric medications? Why is it so hard to get some of the other treatments that exist now, relatively new treatments, stellate ganglion block therapy, ketamine therapy, transcranial magnetic stimulation therapy, psychedelic therapies, vestibular therapies, some of the things that are really good for treating traumatic brain injury, and just simply the role of living a more anti-inflammatory lifestyle, which is about diet, which is about sleep, which is about literally about lifestyle. Why are we not helping people learn to live healthier lifestyles? I guarantee you, if I go out, or if any of us go out and we eat at McDonald's or fast food every single day for a couple of weeks, we're going to be feeling horrible. We're going to be feeling depleted. We're going to feel tired. We're going to feel depressed. Our immune functioning, our endocrine functioning, none of that's going to be optimal. So a lot of what we do to ourselves, as a society. And modern medicine doesn't help us with those things. They don't teach us. They don't talk to us. They don't, for the most part, don't really help redesign our lifestyles, help us redesign our lifestyles. So those are all things that need to happen. Something happened a couple weeks ago in the Congress, in the most recent National Defense Act, in the most recent NDAA, put a thing in there. I don't know what the right language is. I don't have the language, but they've mandated more attention to hormones in special operators. So the next Secretary of Defense is going to have to go in and talk to Congress about hormones and testosterone. So they're now pointing and recognizing, wait a minute, here's a problem that we really have not attended to very well. So that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. That's a good piece. And I think part of what will come out of that is more requirements for study. They're going to mandate research, would be my expectation. They've done this more in recent years with psychedelic treatments. They've mandated that VA and DoD study psychedelic compounds as therapeutics for TBI and existential PTSI type injuries.
It's all very interesting. I'm glad that the DoD is driving a lot of that.
I don't know that the DoD is driving much.
No?
I think the DoD maybe Congress is raising questions.
Okay. I'm wondering where that pressure's coming from.
Well, okay. And so you have quite a few veterans now in Congress.
Yeah.
You have Morgan Luttrell. Congressman Luttrell is a co-author on the Firefighter Syndrome paper, former Navy SEAL. I think another piece of it is, as we were talking about earlier, there's a ground up phenomena that's happening now. Veterans and responders, the boots on the ground folks, are saying, wait a minute, I don't want the starter kit of medications for PTSD. I want something different. I need something different. So I think one of the things that I see everywhere I look now is where the establishment and the leadership are all saying, no, take your time. We've got this. We're studying things. We'll be ready in 5 or 10 or 20 years to provide some good treatments. The grassroots is saying, no way, we need it now. And we didn't talk about this, but the suicide rates.
We say a 22 plus a day. This is necessary now. This is not a 20 year from now problem or solution.
100% exactly right. And then the suicide rates in SOF might be higher than for other groups of veterans. I don't know, but like every week I hear a name of somebody who took their life. In first responders, it's through the roof, as you know. And so we're not just talking about trying to help people, with their quality of life, although that's very important as well, and their functioning in life. We're trying to save lives. We're trying to save marriages. We're trying to save men and women from doing things that they cannot, that can't be undone. You put a Glock in your mouth and you pull the trigger, it's over, and there's no way to recover that from that moment. So that's what brings so much urgency, I think, to what we're trying to do now.
I recently, November 1st, when I finished the first week in December, I underwent ETMS treatment. And it was actually three veterans, but two of them were elected officials. One is Danny Alvarez. He's a state representative here in Florida. And the other one is Senator Jay Collins, who's retired Green Beret. They got a hold of some information from their legal aid, or Danny's legal aid, who's former Ranger, and they were able to get legislation passed to sponsor treatment here in Florida for 2 years for ETMS. And there's 3 clinics now in the state. There's going to be 6 here relatively quickly. And I got a phone call one day and they said, hey, we were told that you'd be interested in this and you're the first patient. Can you be here tomorrow morning at 8 a.m.? I mean, they
Oh,
literally
wow.
opened that day. I walked in and they were still putting desks together. And I said, I have no idea what this is or why. And they told me who was responsible for it. And it's like, well, I guess I got lucky. I've got to tell you, I was not a believer. We did the first EEG, and then I went through and saw the changes over the next 2 EEGs after the treatment.
And
And
say more about what the treatment is, because some listeners.
so actually, I have Lena Grunlow. She's the doctor from ETMS Ohio that's going to be on. I'm interviewing her Wednesday. So ETMS is the transcranial magnetic stimulation. And what they did is they did an EEG to find out the alpha, delta, and theta, beta and theta waves
They use the EEG to
to
bring
target the
more
waves.
precision. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And it is targeted for me for my waves. And they're basically trying to calm down the other waves, but to stabilize the alpha waves. Depression, hypervigilance, anxiety, those sorts of things, cognitive function, the executive functions. From my understanding, it's still very fuzzy to me. So over the course of 15-minute treatments, and it's based on my EEG, the treatment protocol is, for this many seconds over 15 minutes, you'll have this many stimulations. And I guess it's electromagnetic pulses through the front of my head with a
Mm-hmm.
small magnet. You're laying back in a nice leather recliner.
Mm-hmm.
Lights are off, your eyes are closed, and you hear a ding, and 5 seconds later, you get the pulses. And that's a course of 15 minutes. Non-invasive, painless, medication-free. And they describe
Mm-hmm.
it that, what was it? The brain is something like 2% of your body weight, but requires 70% of your body's energy, something like that. Basically, they say get a snack afterwards because your brain's been on a treadmill for 15 minutes in a full sprint, and you're
Okay.
going to take a nap in the afternoon. Well,
Right.
I didn't believe that. Let me tell you something. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, I slept like a baby and I had childlike dreams. So I
Mm.
made sure to get my sugar snack afterwards. But over the
Mm.
course of that month and those 20 treatments, headaches were gone. No migraines, no headaches. I had 2 nightmares during the course of that month, whereas before, even with the medications from the VA, I was experiencing 3, 4, 5 a week. I was having childlike dreams that I could remember. You mentioned earlier going from 8 or 9 to 10 was
Mm-hmm.
nothing. Well,
Mm-hmm.
about halfway through the treatment, spilt milk that would normally take me from 8 to a 10 just became spilt milk. It wasn't a big deal. Hypervigilance
Mm-hmm.
was still an issue, and I don't know that goes away after 30 years of being in that state. But it has been reduced. I went to coffee with Representative Alvarez just the other day and sat with my back to the door for an hour, and it didn't bother me, which normally I would be exhausted if I even did that to begin with. So anecdotally, everything that it was supposed to do, I experienced, and then seeing the
Yeah.
EEG and having it explained to me, everything regulated.
Mm-hmm.
My
Mm-hmm.
issues with cognition are starting to resolve themselves, which is something the VA or any medical professionals that I had dealt with previously, they're like, well, get better sleep. Well, this is untreated sleep apnea. That's all it is. Well, untreated, you've given me the mouthpieces and the CPAPs and all these pills that I should be taking that I don't take.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I take care of this brain fog? Why am I reading the same page 5 times? Oh, your testosterone. No. I mean, it's just, they always say go see everybody else. The point here is
That's
after the,
exactly it. That's
and that's
exactly it,
it. It's
isn't it?
not their
Go
problem.
see
It's
the guy down the
the other
hall.
dude
It's
down
not
the
my
hall
problem.
who
Yep.
just sends you back or says, you need to see a specialist or we'll deal with this next time when you pay the next copay. But ETMS was a game changer. And from what I understand with what I've been told and the research they have so far is that it only will increase. Your brain will continue to heal as long as you check your circadian rhythm, sleep hygiene, no blue lights, sunlight first thing in the morning. Basically everything that Dr. Huberman tells you to do that
Mm-hmm.
with sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
no booze and no painkillers or anything like that, and your brain will continue to heal itself. And it's been remarkable. It really
Yeah.
has.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's phenomenal. I'm glad
yes, sir.
glad you found that. Glad you're benefiting from it. And
I,
now,
they
what
found
is
it
it?
for me.
What
So
is it? Well, yeah, it found you.
yes,
But what does it take to get that for other folks now is the question. How do we get, there's a handful of really powerful, game changing, life changing treatments that we are almost just not using at all because the VA or insurance companies or whoever gets to make those decisions say, well, we don't think those work well enough, or the evidence isn't there yet to use those, or those are too expensive. Yeah, there's some evidence, but they're too expensive. How do we start to change that? And one of the things that I have seen develop over the last 5 years is, especially in the special operations community, folks have just said enough. We're not waiting anymore. I'm not going to wait for the government to figure this out and provide it. Nobody's coming to save us. We're going to do it ourselves. And so you have now all these veteran, or even in some cases active duty or responders started foundations, nonprofits foundations that have risen up and are providing these treatments. And I'll just talk about one because I work very closely with the SEAL Future Foundation. And they were started by former Navy SEALs. And if you're a SEAL and you call their health program, you're going to talk to another SEAL. You're going to talk to somebody who's no longer active duty, but has experienced what you've experienced. So you're talking to a peer, and that peer is usually, most of those guys in the health program are former medics, and we've built a program collaboratively, them, myself, and we have a board of medical providers that cuts across many disciplines. And so a SEAL can call, talk to somebody. They're not doctors, they're not making diagnoses, they're not prescribing treatments, but they'll help figure out, okay, what do you think you need? Here's some things we recommend. And then they will pay for it and they will refer, they've got the referral network. Okay, we think you should go to this functional medicine clinic and do these things. We think you should get a stellate ganglion block. If you want to consider doing that, we'll pay for it. Here's some clinics. Go to your primary care doc and get a lot of this stuff checked out, and run it by them if you need to. I think they've helped in the last 3 years. I think they've served about 20% of all the SEALs alive on this planet in just 3 years.
Wow.
And every year they're getting more and more guys coming to them. Now, the SEAL community is a small community, but that model can be replicated. So what they and I and a few others, we're trying to work with some other groups who have seen what they've done and are getting interested. So there's foundations in Canada that want to do something similar. We're in conversations with folks in Israel that want to do some similar kinds of things. So they're starting to become models for how to sort of do a better job of providing the care that people need without relying on the government. Now, it does they raise about $3 million a year to pay for this. The SEAL Future Foundation does, which is not everybody has the ability to do that. And if we think in terms of responders, we have very little out there in terms of benevolent foundations to serve and help with first responders. So we don't have all the answers, but there are ideas, there are things that are starting to show that they can make a real big difference.
I would agree with that. As far as getting it in every state, I think the veterans that are legislators now, that are in politics, government, I like the idea that they're there. That's why I gave the double thumbs up earlier for those listening at home. I think having that firsthand knowledge, that lived experience, I could say, no, this is exactly what it smells like, and this is what we need to do to fix it. I think that's great. Luckily, the program here for ETMS in Florida is for all first responders and veterans that live in Florida. Ohio's, but it's funded by the state.
That's by the state.
Yes, yes.
Phenomenal. That's phenomenal.
And there's also Ohio that does that. There's several states that are doing that now.
Okay.
And I'm hoping that takes off. Of course, they're reporting their findings back as part of the program to show that the efficacy of it. Hopefully they can scale it to, there's going to be 6 here in Florida, all where the heavy veteran populations are. So hopefully they can scale that. One of the foundations you work with, the Boulder Crest Foundation.
Yes.
They are one of the first responder foundations. I've seen a lot that they do through Travis Gribble, somebody who I follow and hope to speak with here soon. there are foundations out there for first responders. And I think it's because, and again, I don't have anything to back this up other than my own observations, but it seems to me that the veteran community with PTS, operator syndrome, with looking for cures and things to help, basically just coming out and saying, yes, this is a problem. They're about 8 to 10 years ahead of the first responder
Mm.
community in actually
Mhm.
raising our hand and saying we have a problem.
Mhm.
Um, I like that there is a cross reference as it is between the soldiers saying, "Oh yeah, but it's different for us. You know, we come home, we take the fight down range to the bad guy, and firefighters and first responders, they live there." I think that's amazing, and I think that there's nothing in the world that cannot be accomplished if the communities get together and mirror what one another
Yes.
doing. I mean, there's some modifications there, obviously,
Yes.
with funding
Yeah.
and culture, but to scale that from a veteran
Yeah.
aspect to the first responder world, I think that's going to be key moving forward. And I can't wait to see what happens in the next year or two with legislation, with the probable appointment of the new SecDef, and where that's going to go. Forward thinking people,
Mhm.
the Morgan
Yeah.
Luttrells of the world that are sitting in places to be able to make these things happen. So
Yeah.
it's looks exciting.
Yeah. And I share your appreciation for what some veterans are doing for first responders. And I think there's an enormous appreciation from veterans to first responders. And of course, many responders are also
Mhm.
veterans themselves. But I also think there's an enormous appreciation, not just for what responders do and experience, but also with the idea that there's no VA for responders. There's no national program for responders. And then when you look at regions, states, or municipalities, there's quite a bit of variation there. But there's not much. Even if we just go look at the research, for every veteran medical paper, let me do this, let's say this differently. The ratio of medical research papers published in 2023 or 22, I forget which year I looked at it, but it was the ratio for police, from law enforcement to veterans, was 1 to 5. So for every law enforcement paper, there were 5 papers published on veterans. So a
Wow.
huge disparity in the research. And of course, the VA and DoD both fund research for soldiers and veterans. So not only are there is there a national healthcare system for veterans, but they also fund research. It's worse for firefighters. It's 1 to 5 for law enforcement. It's 1 to 20 for firefighters. So that we know almost nothing about firefighters in terms of the medical health effects of the
And that's
profession.
amazing to me because everybody loves a firefighter.
Yeah,
Who
exactly.
doesn't love a firefighter?
We all love them, but when do we ever think about them? Only when we need them.
Every year when I buy their calendar. Oh yeah, and whenever I need them. So
When we need them. When we're calling 911,
yep,
that's when we think about our responders.
yeah, I would agree
And
with that.
the rest of the time, responders are just, they're there, they're functioning, they're doing their thing, but they're kind of invisible and they're in the background.
Unless we're holding them accountable for something, then we're the devil.
Unless we're blaming them for something that,
Yes, well,
yeah,
that too. It's what would they say you did? No, what did you do? So,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
well, you know what? Let's hit some of the high points here. We know that awareness, as we said earlier, this is going to be a ground up thing, and that's where I guess the big push is going to be, at least
Mm-hmm.
initially. So, would you recommend that just being aware that this framework exists and these are the things that are going to occur? And I I want to specify here, and I meant to bring this up earlier, the things that you spoke about, the domains and the framework. It seems to me that other than deciding to take a drink or not to take a drink, or to take a pill or not to take a pill, it seems to me that everything else are things that aren't compelled. These things are happening like on a cellular level, whether we want them to or not. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to highlight that, or at least my understanding of that, to show people that may be experiencing these things. This isn't something that can be cured with a stoic attitude or taking
Right,
taking Motrin. These are
right,
things that
right,
are going to
right.
happen.
And I think, you didn't use the word, but I think there is some stigma towards what are identified as mental illnesses or psychiatric illnesses. And my perspective on that is we're not really talking about psychiatric illnesses here. We're talking about whole body health here. And it's inevitable. You're going to have problems. It's not that you're weak. It's that you're born human. And if you do the job of an operator or a responder, and you do that job for more than a few years, which pretty much people do, you are going to have these problems. It's like the law of gravity. What goes up is going to come down, and there's no shame, there's no stigma. And in fact, part of what I try to always make the point of, so much of what we're talking about here is physiological. And that gets back to PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury. I mean, we can think of it as an injury to the nervous system.
I do like that it's a neurological change, not a defect.
We put the psychological in mental health care. We put the psychiatric diagnoses and the psychological stuff kind of forward, and then we know kind of way in the background, yeah, there's some physiological issues. My perspective is we need to shift them. We should be putting physiology forward, because then we're looking at brain, at endocrine, at hormones, not just how many hours is somebody sleeping at night, but when are they sleeping, and what is their brain doing while they're sleeping, and what is their breathing doing while they're asleep, and all of these other things that have profound effects on what we call, quotes, air quotes, psychological.
I like I like your perspective on that, because it places the physiological ahead of, and I think, like, if I had a broken arm, I could say my arm's not broken, but if you take an X-ray, look, there's the break. It's plain and simple to see. This is not something that you can just positive mindset and do some meditation and it's going to heal.
Right. And no one would feel bad about going to a doctor with a broken arm and saying, doc, I think my leg is broken or my arm is broken. Probably need a cast. And that's just is what it is.
I did, but ultimately I had to get a cast.
You
did. Ultimately it's going to happen. But I think being able to frame it that way, there's no stigma. Yeah. It's like getting shin splints because you ran a marathon. It's if anything, these are, I don't want to call it a badge of honor, but these are stripes that are earned. Yeah. You have to do hard things to earn this. It's an indication that you've done something with your life. That's how I look at this now. That if someone were to call me weak because I had these moments, or I had to do this treatment, or I had to do that treatment, and I've had people who, since I've started this and put my book out, who have said, well, why can't you just be tougher? Well, first, this message obviously isn't for you. You haven't had that moment, and I hope you never have that moment. And if you do, I hope your heart's in a position, or you're in a space to weather it.
And to really go back to the physiological point of it. If we look at what treatments really have profound benefits, I'll just pull two. Mm-hmm. Stellate ganglion nerve block is literally an injection of a medication into the stellate ganglion nerve that runs down your spinal column. It's a purely physiological treatment that has an immediate and profound effect of helping people feel relaxed and lowering their baseline level. I mean, yes, their physiological arousal, but it has the psychological effect of having people feel good and relaxed. The TMS treatment you had, pulsing magnetic stimulation to the head. I mean, it's purely a physiological treatment. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to talk about your childhood. It's not about, some Freudian concept of how you felt about your mother. It's a physiological treatment that has the ability to really radically benefit your brain health and functioning. There's nothing frou-frou about it. These are treatments that can be so incredibly beneficial for people. And there's a quote I want to read from my book, if I may.
Please.
Do you mind? And part of what I think, so we talked about the lack of awareness, the lack of understanding, and why there's so much value in bringing awareness. So I'm going to read you this quote. It's from my book. It's the first quote at the top of chapter 1. And it's by a gentleman named Clay Jensen, who was a master sergeant in the Army's 7th Special Forces Group. He also worked as a private defense contractor overseas. And here's his quote: "Every time I see a new primary care doctor, VA or civilian, they are completely overwhelmed by the sheer number and severity of the different medical issues I have. Nobody knows how to treat me. I'm completely different from any other patient they've had. For over 10 years, I struggled to understand why I am the way I am and to know what was really wrong with me. Then I came across an article on operator syndrome, and I was like, holy shit, I'm normal. I went from feeling totally alone to being part of the tribe again." And I think for me, I hear versions of that said quite frequently. It's the idea that there's a name given to something and that it's common, that everybody, hey, I thought I was the only one, and now I'm learning all the other guys have very similar kind of problems in much the same way and are benefiting from the same kind of treatments that I can benefit from. And I think we just need, more awareness and more education out there.
No, I agree. And the study and the book, to speak once more about the book, when I started reading it, I could have hugged your book, just like the quote that you just read. It brought clarity to what I had been experiencing, but did not know. I didn't know how to fix any of it.
Or even how to talk about it,
No,
probably.
no, it finally gave me a name to all of this. And one of the things that I have found out through having these conversations since I've published the book and started this and with this new mission that I'm on, the most commonly returned answer to me or comment to me was, I thought it was just me, or it's not just me.
Yes.
And
I hear that all the time. I thought it was just me.
yeah, it's and that's a powerful thing to be
Yeah.
to think you're
Yeah.
that alone, especially going
Yeah.
through a transition. Everybody's
Yeah.
still doing the
Yeah.
work, and you're not, and
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
you're withdrawing from your family. I mean, this for anybody listening, Operator Syndrome by Dr. Chris Frueh. Was for me roadmap. This was the start of the way forward. It's amazing the work you've done with this, the paper, the contributors in the original study, everybody who gave their quotes. I mean, there are rock stars. If you pay attention to the operator world and Google some of these folks, if you have not heard of them, I mean, you've got the Satterleys in here. You've got Mike Sorelli. I mean, Gabrielle Lyon, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, Andrea Gallagher. I mean, just the people that are in here that contributed to this with their own experiences. It's remarkable. And I was telling people when this first came out and I first started speaking of it, they're like, "Oh, I'm not an operator." I'm like, yeah, it's a bit of a misnomer. If you take away the title and look at the physiological things that are happening, our experiences may be different or they may be experience adjacent, but our physiological responses and our emotional responses to the experiences that we have are damn near identical. It's the human condition, and this is just me speaking from a lay standpoint. This affects a lot more people than just operators, and I think this is groundbreaking work. Finding this framework and putting it out there, and I think this should be discussed in every fire academy, every law enforcement academy, EMS academy. This should be put out everywhere, just to let people know that this is. Andy Stump said it best on his podcast with you last year, that there's a price and there's a cost. And,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be aware of those things when you're coming in. This is the cost of doing business, and this is the price you're going to pay. Me personally, I wouldn't have changed. I would have changed how I treated myself better. I would have answered to these things earlier than I did, but I would do it all over again. And I think that's a common theme that you'd hear from anybody in this space.
I absolutely hear that from pretty much everybody. I'd do it all over again if I had the chance to. I wouldn't change a thing other than how I might take care of myself. Well, Doug, I kind of feel like we're kind of wrapping up here. I want to first thank you for what you're doing, and I'm looking forward to finishing reading your book. It's terrific. I will be recommending it. And thank you for having me on your show. And if you ever want me to come back for another conversation, just say the word. I'll be happy to come back.
Chris, I got to tell you, this is thank you. I again, fanboy moment. I'm usually much more articulate than this. And in closing, Do you have anything that you'd like to put out there? Any parting shots? What are you doing next? What's the next study?
My only parting shot is there's hope. I always like to conclude on a message of hope. There's hope for healing and recovery. I know so many guys, so many families, so many wives who have gone from very, very dark um, points in life to absolutely thriving and being happy and living their best life. And I know that. I know operators, I know law enforcement, I know firefighters, I know people who were artillery or combat engineers, infantry. I just know so many people who have been able to find the health and the healing and the recovery to really live a thriving life.
Well, that is amazing. Again, thank you so much for this and your time today. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Tell This Story. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Chris Frueh. If you'd like to connect with Dr. Frueh, you can find him on Instagram at Dr. Chris Frueh or on his website, chrisfrueh.com. Links are going to be in the show notes. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and comment. Help us spread the word. You can also follow me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook, or just visit my website at dougwhiteofficial.com. We'd love to hear from you, whether it's constructive feedback, suggested guests, or topics you'd like us to cover. Until next time.